Could the legends of ancient gods refer to the exploits of elite humans, or perhaps ancient aliens? The mass of references in ancient records is akin to stories of UFO sightings over the past century. There have just been too many examples, some of which are really inexplicable, even to modern science today. Good day, folks. This week's episode is going to look at Ra, known in both Egypt and Sumer, later known as Marduk in Babylon, and by the Persians. Could this pagan god have actually been a living person? The original Lord Most High, El Elyon or Enlil, was worshipped across the Sumerian and Semitic cultures. His successor, Ra, was worshipped in Egypt as well. The veneration of Ra persisted for over 9,000 years, with many mundane references pointing to Ra possibly being a real living creature rather than an inert idol. If he was a real person, how did he manage to immortalize himself? Did he really have a long life? Or was his persona carefully passed down through adult sons? He had a very complex headdress which would disguise the wearer. So it's possible that maybe successive members of the family inherited the godship. Can we rule out Ra and his ilk being visiting aliens? Indeed, we have a number of ancient references to gods departing Earth, which caused great consternation to their worshippers. I hope you enjoyed the previous episode, where I pushed the boundaries a bit, considering links between Horus and Jesus. Whilst purely speculative, the startling conjecture drew conclusions from factual evidence, leading us to possibilities starkly at variance with conventional beliefs. This week, I am feeling playful again. So let's explore some of the wilder possibilities to see if the ideas may have legs. Could the legends of ancient gods refer to the exploits of elite humans, or perhaps ancient aliens? The mass of references in ancient records is akin to stories of UFO sightings over the past century. There have just been too many examples, some of which are really inexplicable, even to modern science today. Some of the stories involving ancient pagan gods do imply quite strongly a real presence. They were seen by masses of people. For example, the Egyptians believed that Ra had ruled Egypt for millennia prior to the devastation which led to the arrival of the falcon, Horus, and his 7 helpers. We talked about that before. Horus was believed to be the grandson of Ra, and the devastation story, which we have from the Edfu temple texts, may reflect the destruction wrought by a tsunami sweeping up the Nile Valley following the meteor impact off Greece in 9620 BC. Ra was very popular during the dynastic period, from around 3200 BC up to the death of Cleopatra, 30 BC. Sometimes he was in Egypt, sometimes going away for centuries. When Ra was absent from Egypt, he was known as Amun-Ra, the hidden Ra, often simply abbreviated to Amen. Ra and Amen occur very regularly in the throne names of Egyptian pharaohs. For example, Amenhotep, Amenophis, and Ramesses.
So, pharaohs took drawn names denoting whether Ra was in situ or absent?
Yes, throne names of pharaohs from around 1900 BC point to Ra having departed Egypt. They started calling him Amun-Ra, the hidden Ra. His followers ended their prayers with Amen. Please return to us, O hidden one. I've reviewed both Christian and Muslim theological websites which discuss questions from believers asking about the meaning and the origin of the word Amen. Both religious sites tend to give rather circular answers. A typical Christian site will say, well, the Lord, in the Lord's Prayer, he closed the prayer by saying, Amen. Not true. We know that the last few phrases of the Lord's Prayer were added in the 4th or 5th century, the element referred to as the doxology, including the final word, Amen. In fact, some more modern Bible translations do not include it. So the explanation doesn't fly. Similarly, the Muslim theologian's explanation is a little weak. Firstly, it's admitted that the word Amen does not appear anywhere in the Quran. And the explanation is that, it's traditional. It's always been that way. But I think it's interesting. I suspect the leaders of both religions would be horrified to find that it actually is most likely to have originated in the worship of Ra. The movements of Ra can be tracked quite easily from the throne names. It seems likely that Ra was in Mesopotamia for the founding of the city built in his name, Dinkur-Ra, which is translated as the gateway of Ra. This was founded in around 2300 BC within the Sumerian Empire. Soon after, Ra returned to Egypt, and as the sun continued to rise in the constellation of Taurus, the kings and emperors in Mesopotamia reverted or continued worshipping Enlil under the sign of the bull. We can then look at a few centuries later when the Sumerian Empire had dissolved around 1950 BC. Roll forward a few centuries, and you get the rise of the Amorite kingdom based on what is now Babylon. And one of the key kings is named Sin-Melabit, the sign being a reference to the god Sin, who was the son of the bull, son of Taurus, hence the golden calf. But his son, who succeeded him and was probably the most successful Amorite king, is Hammurabi, with Ra in the name. So that marks, I think, the return of Ra from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And it was soon after that that either somebody, whether it was Ra himself or his priesthood, decided to change his name in Mesopotamia from Ra to Marduk, which you'll find many references to in various texts, including biblical texts.
So, unlike Egypt, which sailed on serenely, Mesopotamia saw the rise and fall of many cultures and empires. How long did Marduk endure?
Yes, it's true. In Mesopotamia, we saw many kingdoms rise and fall. But the most interesting facet is that the recognition and worship of Marduk endured for thousands of years throughout all these different cultures. And let's quickly visit some of that, because it's quite interesting how it was able to continue. With the fall of Sumer and Arcadia, which were a sort of unified two cultures merged together, suffered disasters around 1950 BC. The leadership of Mesopotamia had passed effectively to Babylon. And that seemed to coincide with Marduk's return from Egypt. We see the rise of the Amorite Empire, and the switch to Ra appearing in the throne names, i.e. with Hammurabi. Amorite rule peaked with Hammurabi, who actually ruled for about 60 or 70 years. 150 years after his reign, Babylon was conquered by the Assyrians. 1595, they crushed the army and destroyed all the city walls. However, instead of staying there, they just fled back north, leaving the city completely defenseless. And it was occupied by Kassites who came from the east. The Kassites were unfamiliar with Akkadian language and certainly with the astronomical traditions that the Amorites had inherited from the Sumerians. So the study of astronomy morphed into the practice of astrology and fortune telling. Roll forward about 150 years, and Babylon actually became subject to Egypt under Thutmose III. Roll forward another century, and Assyrian power was waxing again and became dominant over Babylon from 1350 to 1150 BC. Then followed a century under Aramaean control, a people that arose in what is now central Syria. And it's interesting to note the Arameans, as a relatively short-lived culture, are referenced in Genesis. If you remember, Abraham sent his son to find a non-Canaanite wife in Aram, another pointer to the timing of the authorship of the Torah, because Aram only existed for a couple of centuries around 1000 BC, long after Abraham's, well, a millennium after Abraham. Then from 911 BC, Babylon was back under Assyrian control again, but they revolted a number of times. And this place gets particularly interesting. One revolt, memorably under a chief named Marduk Apla Idina. This revolt was savagely put down by the Assyrians, led by Sennacherib in 689 BC. He, unfortunately for him, decided to destroy the temples of Marduk. It was a revolt led by somebody who was aligned with Marduk. So he destroyed a number of Marduk's temples in Babylon. This outraged people to such an extent that he was killed by two of his own sons. Extraordinary. But it shows the power, which may be just a memory, but could it have been evidenced by a real entity of some kind? The episode, the revenge by Sennacherib, showed that the heartlands of northern Iraq, they'd still remained loyal to Enlil and his son Sin. But in Babylon, they had remained loyal to Marduk. And indeed, Marduk's grandson, Ashur, from whence today we derive the names of both Assyria and Syria. Next, it was the turn of the Chaldeans. They were a tribe that came out of the northern Arabian desert, maybe the area around Tamar, quickly took over southern Iraq, and by 626 BC had established themselves as a new ruling power in Babylon. Their rule lasted less than a century, with the penultimate Chaldean king being named Labishi Marduk. Again, you see the throne name is always in the king's name. That made sure people knew where his loyalties lay. And again, it's another pointer to the late authorship of Genesis. The phrase Ur of the Chaldeans betrays the fact that the Chaldeans only emerged out of the desert around 800 BC, and yet the city of Ur was destroyed 1,200 years prior to that. However, the last Chaldean king, Nabonidus, who ruled from 556 to 539 BC, seized power in a coup, toppling Labishi Marduk Then he brought statues of sign from both Haran and Tamar to Babylon. Historians treat Nabonidus as an enigma because he spent 11 of his 17 years ruling not in Babylon, the massive metropolitan capital of the empire, but in the oasis town of Tamar, deep in the desert in northern Arabia. Personally, though, I think there is possibly an explanation. Going back to Abraham's time, 2000 BC, so that's 15 centuries beforehand, the two capitals of Sumer, Ur in the south and Haran in the north, were both dedicated to the god Sign. The old Sumerian towns of Ur, Uruk, Nippur, etc. were all abandoned and disappeared long before Nabonidus had come around. His dedication to the god Sign would make it logical for him to reign from Haran, or maybe somewhere associated with Sign in the south, like Tamar. So what better than to base himself in Tamar? Sinai, the land belonging to the god Sign, originally extended westwards from the area where the city of Ur was built across northern Arabia. It's not the triangle of land to the south of Israel that we call Sinai today. And it's interesting to contrast. In one of Paul's epistles, he refers very clearly to Sinai being in northern Arabia. It was only Emperor Constantine's mother, Catherine, who did a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She decided she wanted to find out where the mountain was that Moses went up to find the tablets of the Ten Commandments, and she decided that was the mountain, so this must be Sinai. And that's how our current geography arose. Interesting. In fact, Tamar's long been associated with the Israelites. Possibly some stayed on after their wanderings in Sinai during the period referred to as the Exodus. When you dig, you find other intriguing facts. The name Tamar itself shares the same root as the name of a grandson of Abraham. Scholars suggest Nabonidus may have attempted to be unifying the worship of the moon god, Sign, with that of Yahweh. Consider, biblically, Moses' discovery of the new name of God, Yahweh, from the burning bush incident, occurred, most likely, quite close to Tamar. And soon, Moses' brother led the people to worship the golden calf, the god Sign, also suggesting commonality. I think this link was only rejected much later for theological reasons.
So it seems with Nabonidus kicking Marduk out of Babylon, Marduk's reign was over?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, it's almost as though Marduk took offence of being turfed out the city he had founded 18 centuries earlier. Suddenly, an expansionary force emerged from across the Zagros mountains, and a huge Persian army came to attack the Chaldeans. When I say huge, there are various records that suggest that the army that Cyrus led numbered 600,000. And incidentally, it's thought that if you go through, and you've got to be very dedicated, if you go through very carefully the book of Numbers, you'll discover that the supposed Israelite army, or able-bodied men, was 603,000, which suggests a little game of one-upmanship was going on in the drafting of the document. And again points to it being drafted in Babylon. Anyway, the interesting thing is, as the Persian army approached Babylon, both the Babylonian and the Persian records described the army being co-led by Cyrus and Marduk. And when the Babylonian forces saw Marduk, the records say that the Babylonian army threw down their weapons and opened the gates of Babylon to welcome their God back. Would you do that for an idol? I wonder. It's worth thinking about. Now, if you look in the Bible, Isaiah 45 describes the Persian capture of Babylon with the forces led by Yahweh. Isaiah 45, 1 through 8 are recorded almost verbatim as a section of the Cyrus cylinder. This is a very carefully inscribed cylinder that we have the original actually in the British Museum at the moment. Except where Isaiah attributes the leadership and the victory to Yahweh, the Cyrus cylinder attributes it to Marduk. The Cyrus cylinder describes the conquests and Cyrus' magnanimous actions afterwards as being the will of Marduk. Of course, Cyrus never considered Marduk to be God. Cyrus was a Zoroastrian. In Zoroastrianism, the ultimate creator, Ahura Mazda, is transcendent, beyond human comprehension, without gender or form, and strictly no idols are used. In stark contrast, Cyrus described Marduk as an elite human who was his teacher, his counselor, and a wise guide. Perhaps the Israelites also saw Marduk leading the Persian forces, and their priests told them it was Yahweh. After all, no one would have seen Yahweh. So this great individual coming to deliver liberation, freedom, why wasn't it Yahweh? Cyrus recorded that upon Marduk's request, he returned all the statues of sign to their rightful temples, Tamar, Haran, and allowed all peoples that had been forcibly moved to Babylon by the Chaldeans to be allowed to return to their homelands, including the Jews. Zoroastrianism taught Cyrus to respect other people's religions. But for his people, there were no statues in stone or wood. For me, it seems implausible to claim all these policies were promulgated by a mythical being. It all points to a real individual, elite human or alien, but apparently very human-like. Thus, we've traced Ra Marduk across a large number of cultures: Egyptian, Sumerian, Akkadian, Amorite, Chaldean, and Persian. That's over a period of nearly 2,000 years. It does not seem that Marduk was thought of as God, the designer of the universe, but maybe as Lord and ruler of the planet. He was associated with Aries, and his sign was the ram. Who said the Son of God was a lamb? Think about it. Moreover, after these events, we hear no more activities suggesting the presence of Marduk. Did he die? Did he depart earth? In Greek and Roman times, the same gods, the same Mesopotamian Egyptian gods, comprised the senior pantheon. But all references to these gods were seemingly of a remote power. Any fighting they did was far off in the heavens. One does not read anything that suggests a physical presence. Something had changed.
That's an interesting distinction. Do we have any descriptions of God living on earth who departed?
Yeah, we have extensive documented references to gods departing. Firstly, we have the strange demise of the highly advanced Sumerian Empire around 1950 BC. Some years after Abraham's father, the governor of the capital city, had migrated his family up north to the northern capital of Haran. The main records we have, which document the ending of the Sumerian civilization, are referred to as the Lamentation texts. These describe a silent, wind-borne death spreading across all the Sumerian cities south of Babylon, causing most animals and people to die painful deaths. There appears to have been some warning of this disaster, as many are reported as fleeing. Remnants of a Sumerian diaspora can be found in the succeeding Babylonian and Hurrian, which is on the Turkish-Syrian border, cultures. The Lamentation texts tell of some of the gods simply abandoning their people, and of other gods being distraught at seeing the deaths and being forced to abandon their palace temples. Some have suggested the descriptions point to something akin to radiation sickness caused by nuclear fallout. After the demise of Sumer, only a handful of the Sumerian gods continue to be referred to in texts which imply a physical presence. For others, it was their memory that was revered, as the Egyptians worshipped the hidden Ra, Amen, and others prayed for gods who had departed to return to them. After around 2000 BC, only a few key individuals continued to be referred to by Middle Eastern cultures in terms implying intimate contact. We have Marduk, connected with Babylon. We have Ishkur, associated with the Hittites and the Hurrians in Turkey and northern Syria, where they became known as Adad and Teshub, respectively. Sin continued, associated with Haran and Tamar. Shamash, who may have become known as Yahweh, and Shamash's sister, Inanna or Ishtar, who may have starred as the Queen of Sheba. By coincidence, after 2000 BC, we see the rise of new cultures in other parts of the world, each of which attribute their origin to the arrival of a god from heaven to initiate a new dynastic royalty. China, Japan, and early South American cultures all attribute their inception as a civilization to the arrival of a few gods from heaven. This may imply some gods relocated to these areas and developed new cultures. We don't know. Other texts are suggestive of later divine departures. In the Temple of Sin in Haran, 4 columns have been excavated bearing very detailed inscriptions attributed to the last king of Babylon, that Nabonidus we referred to, and his mother, who was high priestess to Sin, went under the name of Adagupi. These tell of the departure of Sin, dated to the defeat of the Assyrian army in 610 BC, when Assyrian forces supported by Sin were defeated by Babylonian forces supported by Marduk. We don't know if these were behind the 2 generals of the 2 armies. After earnest praying by Adagupi, Sin is recorded as briefly returning in the year 556 BC to bless the enthronement of Nabonidus before his final farewell, where he is claimed to have said he would never return. There's a bit of a pattern here. A dispassionate assessment of Yahweh might conclude he similarly departed or was killed around 586 BC, perhaps. The biblical account emphasizes that Yahweh's covenants will be everlasting. That once his temple is built, he will always dwell with his people. Solomon built and commissioned the new temple for Yahweh around 970 BC. However, a mere 40 years later, upon Solomon's death in 931 BC, the 12 tribes split, with 10 peeling away to form the northern kingdom of Israel leaving Jerusalem with control of only two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Yahweh never seemed to return and reunite the tribes, nor prevent most of the breakaway tribes being marched off to Nineveh, firstly by Belzar in 740, followed by two more waves by his successors Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. The standard Assyrian policy for conquered peoples was to march them off into new pastures whilst rotating in people from other areas of their empire. Interestingly, the new settlers, which eventually became known as the Samaritans, genetically have recently been assessed to have been mainly Arameans, Aram, and Amorites, descendants of the first Babylonian Empire. These intermarried with the remnants of the 10 tribes. Interestingly, according to 2 Kings 17 verse 30, these newcomers mainly worshipped Nergal, the first son of Enki and brother to Ra. But they also felt that they needed to worship the god of the territory that they had been relocated to. Accordingly, both biblical and Assyrian records show the new settlers requested the Assyrian king to send one of Yahweh's priests to teach the new settlers, which became the Samaritans, to teach them Yahweh's requirements. And one of the Israelite priests that had been taken captive to Nineveh was duly returned to what is now Samaria, or was then Samaria. Or rather interesting. Despite promising it would be his eternal abode, Yahweh allowed the temple built to his specifications by Solomon to be utterly destroyed in the year 586 BC.
After considering these records, what are your final conclusions?
But it seems to me there's a lot of ancient records that point to the people of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia viewing their gods as real people. They were worshipped when present, and their departure was mourned. They certainly seem to have been superhuman, maybe aided by having access to some advanced technology, but they aged and died. They were recognized as rulers, lords of the planet, many remembered as helping recovery from ancient devastations, but they were not seen as God in the sense of designing or creating the universe. And also note that in this assessment, I'm not making any judgments about ancient gods worshipped outside the Middle East. No other cultures have left such detailed records involving descriptions of their gods' activities which date back anywhere near as far. Greek mythology is also interesting. Having conquered all the lands of the Middle East that we've discussed, their culture formed the bedrock of the succeeding Roman Empire. Greek gods were seen as forming really two tiers. The Olympiad of senior gods, like modern-day superheroes, were drawn heavily from ancient Egyptian and Sumerian gods. But they were topped by a more transcendent and utterly remote ultimate creator who could not be understood by humans and who created the Logos to communicate with humanity. You can refer to John 1 verse 1. It seems to me that Christian teaching that the unbelievers all worshipped inert stone and wooden statues was developed to denigrate powers they did not understand or were frightened of. The pagan gods concept. In the same way that Catholic Church statues of Jesus, Mary, and sundry apostles are not intended to be worshipped, just acknowledged as representations, the statues of pagan gods were clearly idealized representation. These ancient gods were always linked with various symbols, particularly the zodiac and planets. But looking at their role in cultural history, one does not conclude that they were completely imaginary. If you found this episode interesting, please press the like button, and we've got more for you in a few days' time. Thank you.